Okay, so now that we kind of have a background in the early bilingual versus second language learner kind of questions, right? The comparisons. Let's ask a bigger question, right? Which is, what can comparing second language and early bilinguals tell us about the critical period? Now, again, we said they both know two languages, but they differ in age of acquisition. So then we have two possibilities. Okay, so imagine originally what we observed is the second language was different from a monolingual. And so what we're going to do is say, well, the relationship between L2 and monolingual is this way. If it's this way, then you're going to see this behavior with bilinguals. You'll see what I mean with these examples. So here, if a second language learner differs from monolingual due to the critical period, right? If differences in first and second language acquisition are due to critical period, then you should also see those differences with early bilinguals. See what I'm saying? If age matters, second language is different from everybody who learned them early, whether they're monolingual or bilingual. Okay? However, if a second language learner differs from a monolingual due to knowing two languages, right? If the fact that they have two languages in their mind is what's causing the differences from monolinguals, then you would expect to see some similarities between second language learners and early bilinguals. That makes this sort of 3-point comparison really, really interesting, right? Because second language and early bilinguals share knowing two languages. Early bilinguals and monolinguals share early age of acquisition. And so you can kind of, if you compare the three of them together, you can start to kind of piece apart which piece of it is age of acquisition. Okay? So our test case, as I told you when we started, was relative clause attachment. And to do that, let's have a mini review, which will be, again, super useful for your upcoming assignment, but there's more stuff. Some ways that relative clauses can differ include type of relative clause, an attachment type or attachment site. An attachment site is crucial to what I'm presenting right now, but let's take a glance at type of relative clause because I want to make sure you have those two things different in your mind. It's important that they're different, okay? Okay, so in Linguistics 423, you spent a good deal of time talking about what type of relative clause each example is. So here I saw the man that mentioned you, and I saw the man that you mentioned. Notice that in each, the trace is in a different spot, and the types off to the right are different. The trace, of course, is in subject position inside the relative clause for the subject relative clause. It's an object position for the object relative clause, right? And so what matters for type, overall type, is position of the trace. Now, attachment is a little different. Consider these three. The man that you mentioned is stopping by. I visited the man that you mentioned. I saw the sister of the man that you mentioned. That relative clause that you mentioned is exactly the same in every case. And in fact, if you refer back to the previous slide, that you mentioned is an object relative clause. Because if I were to pop that trace back in, it would be right after mentioned, because you mentioned the man, right? Now, here, what it's attached to differs, and putting them in a row, I believe, is going to make this the most clear. So that you mentioned in all three cases is attached to the man, but the difference is the man is in a different spot in the argument structure in each case. So in the first two, the man that you mentioned stopping by, and I visited the man that you mentioned, it's in subject and object position respectively, right? The man is doing the action in the first one, and the man is receiving the action as the visitor in the second one. Now, the object of the third example is the sister, right? So I know that I saw the sister of the man that you mentioned, that the person I saw is the sister, ergo she's the object, because I can replace that with a pronoun very easily. I saw her. What about the sister of the man that you mentioned? Oh, I saw her, right? And so clearly the object is the sister, not the man. So what is the man? For all intents and purposes, something else, right? But you've been referring to these as oblique DPs. And so this is oblique DP attachment, okay? And we're going to need this particular version of attachment for what I'm about to talk about. But it's also relevant to and some of the more complex examples you may find out in the world as part of your assignment. Okay, so oblique in some sense is neither the subject nor the object. Specifically, it's something possessed by the object in this example, okay? But it's neither the subject nor the object. Great. So when I talk about attachment, it indicates which DP is modified by the relative clause. Which DP with respect to the verb argument. Okay, so let's discuss some parallel examples. For the following two, I want you to place the traces in your mind and then decide whether the relative clause is a subject or an object relative clause. The first thing that we did. Ready? I spoke to the scientist who worked all weekend. I spoke to the assistant who worked all weekend. Okay. As you probably can tell, 1 and 2 have the same type of relative clause. Okay. That's because the trace in both cases is hanging out right after who, right? In subject position. These are both subject relative clauses. What are they attached to? Well, they're attached to the object, right? The person being spoken to. I spoke to them, right? Yes? They're subject relative clauses attached to the object. Okay. Now take a look at 3. And once again, you're noticing there's an oblique DP in here, right? I spoke to the assistant of the scientist who worked all weekend. And my question to you is, who worked all weekend? This is important for what we're about to talk about, right? Who worked all weekend? Now, I'm going to put back in and make it 2 versions, and I'm going to color code it again, right? If I make the assistant blue and the scientist red, as I did in 1 and 2, I actually have 2 versions of 3. I'm going to call the other version 4 for the moment. There is a version where the who, right, the trace right after it, it's referring to, it's attached to the assistant, right? In which it's the assistant who worked all weekend, right? And in 4, it could be attached to the oblique DP to the scientist, and it's the scientist who worked all weekend. So the answer is either, technically, could be the one that worked all weekend. English does have a preference for the scientist. We call this low attachment. In this literature, low attachment is an attachment to the oblique DP, right? And this is a sort of a processing phenomenon, okay? If you're curious, there's several proposals for why this happens, one of which is the fact that typically we would refer to the assistant of the scientist as the scientist's assistant. And if we did that and we changed it, it wouldn't be ambiguous at all. I spoke to the scientist's assistant who worked all weekend. And the only person who could have worked all weekend in that case is the assistant. So in English, by the fact that we spell out the assistant to the scientist, we have a tendency to parse it as the lower DP.